Welcome to the John Freakin' Muir Pod. Lace up those boots and sling on the pack for a romp through trails, short and long. With your host and Renaissance man, Doc. It's time to embrace the suck.
Welcome back to another week on the trail. I'm Doc, and this is the John Freakin' Muir Pod. Let's start off with a reminder. If you are enjoying the podcast, take just a minute, help us out, and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. And if you're not enjoying the pod, well, just go ahead and keep that to yourself. All right, on to this week's episode. I am very excited to welcome to the pod a man who has done something no other person has done before or since. Go to the South Pole, the North Pole, and the top of Mount Everest in 1 year. It is my pleasure to give a big JFM pod welcome to explorer and author Eric Larsen.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So have you listened to the pod before, Eric? And it's okay if you haven't.
No, I haven't.
Okay. So we have a regular feature. We have a regular feature on the pod. It's called the Pro Tip Insight of the Week. And that's towards the end of the episode, I'm going to turn to you and I'm going to say, Eric, what is your pro tip insight of the week? What piece of advice, what insight can you share with our listeners to make their next adventure that much better? So don't be surprised when that comes up.
Okay.
All right. Also, I know as a polar explorer and a mountaineer, you must have a lot of gear. And so I wanted to try and pin you down and see if you could identify a favorite piece of gear or a must-have piece of gear, and if there's a particular brand that you prefer.
Sure.
That's right.
No
now.
problem. Yeah.
Okay. What do you have?
Oh, you want to do it right now?
Yeah, let's do it now.
Okay. Yeah. The gear one or the tip?
Tip comes at the end. This is the gear one.
Oh, gear. I mean, I think, same answer every time for this. Garmin and Reach is one of my most critical pieces of gear, not only from a safety perspective, but also from just a basic communication and navigational perspective. I've had that thing all over the planet, use it every day. And it's always been reliable. And like I said, it's an important part of not only just safety, but also my general communication plan.
Okay. All right. Let's before we get to your adventures, and you've got quite a few adventures. Let's go back a bit and talk about your background, where you grew up, and when you were growing up, did you have a lot of experience in the outdoors? Was that part of your family dynamic when you were a kid?
Yeah, I grew up in the Midwest in Wisconsin, and we spent a lot of time outside. My dad was the director of a nature center, and so I tell my kids this all the time, which is like we never stayed in a hotel, and our big thing in the summers was going on a canoe trip or going camping for a couple weeks. And so that was definitely a part of who I was or what our family identity was. For my part, I was just really interested in being out as much as I could, though I kind of took that to a whole nother level, and was always just trying to find places and ways to be outside as much as I possibly could.
Okay. And do you continue that same tradition with your family now?
I mean, yeah, I like, not to get into family dynamics, but I grew up in a house that was pretty singularly focused to the fault of everything else. And part of that is really good because you get to take all that in. And so for my kids, I want them to be able to be exposed to all sorts of stuff. That being said, I think there is a lot of value in being outside, no matter what the capacity is, whether it's, going out and having a picnic lunch or going on a 7-day hiking trip or anything in between. So I think there's a lot of value in that connection to nature, and as well as for me now as a dad, I see a lot of value in allowing my kids to be outside and unencumbered by myself or walls or whatever. And so they get a chance to run and climb and, you know, do whatever. And so they've been all over and done everything. I mean, we go camping all the time, and have a really fun setup, and it's anything from, you know, mountain biking to just car camping to rafting, canoeing, hiking, you name it.
Right, right. That's an outstanding perspective. I'm sure you've heard the term helicopter parent.
Yeah.
And I think helicopter parent has actually evolved into now what's called a backpack parent, where the parent, you know, is a visual. You know, you see the parent sitting on the kid's back in the backpack, kind of, you know, whispering in the ear and telling, okay, got to go this way, got to do this, got to do
Yeah.
that. Really micromanaging kids, and I think that really contributes to, you know, kids not being able to think for themselves and make decisions for themselves,
Totally.
and just having that free time to explore and to do what else. I mean, that's so valuable. I remember growing up, you know, both my parents were working, and so I was a latchkey kid. I was,
Yeah. Same.
you know,
Yeah.
just making my own decisions and hanging out with friends, and you know, we made good decisions, but you know, there is that danger there. But I think it really
Yeah.
promotes a sense of independent thinking and self-reliance and skills that are so valuable.
Yeah, I think those skills and kind of philosophies translate into a lot of aspects of not only childhood but also adult life. And it's not something that you just get in 1 second. You know, it takes practice, and it takes making some mistakes. And so I do feel, again, that when you're outside, you do have the opportunity to be able to do all those things with, for the most part, without these very severe consequences. You know, like if you fall down, you get back up, and if you get a little turnaround, you know, hopefully you find your way. It is a little hard at times. I would say I grew up as a latchkey kid too, and you know, in the 70s, and it was a different world back then. I mean, we were on our own, and I don't know if I could disconnect as much as my parents maybe did. And I think about that because I think there are some real benefits, like you said, that independence, alliance. I think are a result of that. And so, you know, I just try to be mindful about all those things and hopefully point in at least a decent direction. It's never perfect.
That's right. Got to set a good foundation, but still give them enough of their own space to make their own decisions and think things out sometimes.
Totally.
So you grew up in the 70s. You're dating yourself.
I know. I don't like to say that. I don't like to say that because, like, there go all the sponsorships, you know. No, man. But I grew up in the 80s too. But yeah, it was like, I mean, I talked again, just well, there's a couple interesting aspects of that. Is one, you know, on the expedition side of things, the world was just different. Like getting into adventure wasn't something that you joined up with a community, especially in Wisconsin. So all of the things that I did were very self-motivated and self-reliant, and I had to find out the information on my own and get experience by my own. And there wasn't this kind of like very clear cut, like there was no thing as like a outdoor ambassador or an athlete, you know, like maybe you saw a few pictures of some tents in National Geographic once a year, but that was about it. So it was just different in that sense. And of course the technology was a lot different too. So I talked to my kids there. My son asked me the other day, he's like, well, how did you call people when you're in the car? I'm like, it didn't happen. So.
Yeah, I tell my kids I had to get up and change the channel.
Yeah, exactly. Totally. Same. Yeah. And there was only 4 channels or whatever it was.
That's right. That's right. We didn't walk around with the internet in our pocket. You know,
No.
you had to look something up. You had to go to the library or look through the encyclopedias to find out the information. Different world.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, like I was, I mean, you know, whatever, I'm not saying now is bad or then was better. It was just different. And I think when we talk about some of these things now, you kind of have to look at it the context of how much the world has changed, and not only just the past 40 years or 50 years or whatever it is, but also just within the last 10 years as well.
Right. I think the human brain is wired to remember good things longer and forget the bad things. I think that's why women are able to have more than one child. They forget about all the pain and just remember the good stuff. And I think that it's just a tendency of our brains to kind of forget the negative stuff. It wasn't that we didn't
Yeah.
have problems back then. We
Yeah.
certainly had problems, but there's the tendency to think about, the past as the good old days.
Yeah, totally. And I think also just your kind of demeanor and your mindset. For myself, I'm definitely an optimist. And so I always try to look at the good of things. But yeah, of course, I remember all the positives. My mom would say that I remember all the negative things, but, I think that actually also is a good expedition skill set as well. At least for the types of trips that I do when we're just kind of muddling through one bad situation after the next, and you kind of have to be able to move on past that trip and potentially do another hard, difficult thing. You definitely have to find the crystals in all that mud.
Right. Now, I heard you mention backpacking briefly when you're going through your background. Have you had much experience doing any kind of through hiking or multi-day backpacking trips?
I mean, I've done a bunch of backpacking over the years. I mean, it's such a easy sport to access. And I'm a huge fan of just human powered travel in general. And, I would say backpacking is very similar to polar travel in the sense that you're, this small person in this big space, and it does take a long time to traverse these areas. It's a lot of time. So yeah, I've spent, all sorts of different times hiking. I was a backcountry ranger in Alaska, and we were backpacking all the time. And I had this old like external frame camp trails pack, and we would have to haul in like 4 or 5 days worth of food and gear and like tools and stuff. And it wasn't the right fit for me. And I had to twist the hip strap so that it would fit around my waist, and it was just like a little mesh on the metal frame, and it would give me bruises on the back. I'd have to walk like it by the end of the those kind of stints that we would do. I'd have to be walking like hunched over, and that was brutal. But I lived out in Colorado back in the day, prior to moving around again. Did a bunch of hiking here, which is just phenomenal. There's so many awesome wilderness areas. I lived in northern Minnesota for a long time. There's a Superior hiking trail there, which, I was on somewhat regularly either with friends. And I do a lot of just like hiking and photography and training. So I'm on trails all the time. I've never done not necessarily for lack of interest. It's just I'm interested in a lot of other things too. I've never done a big through hike. Although my son last month, he's like, I want to hike the Appalachian Trail. I'm like, okay, sure, let's go do it. And then I've also been doing these kind of multi-sport adventures for the past few years, which is kind of taking a state and going from one border to the next and dividing it up by 3 sports. So it's usually like a bike, a hike, and then some sort of water thing. And so I've had some really nice opportunities to hike through areas that I've never hiked before. Like, I was from Wisconsin. I never really did much hiking there. And I was on the Ice Age Trail for 3 days, which was awesome. We did a trip across New York, kayaking, hiking, and biking, and hiked through, the Adirondacks, which I had never done, and pretty much got my ass handed to me. And even hiked through Kansas, which was incredible. So, it's not my main pursuit, but it occupies a significant amount of my time, I would say.
So it sounds like you have these self-created triathlons that go across states, right? Is that an accurate description?
Yeah, I call them Stateathons. It's kind of this
nice.
Yeah. Well, it's a throwback to how I got involved with adventure. And, quite honestly, the question about backpacking, I just like being outside and camping. Like, I call myself a professional camper. I don't care what the mode is. I just want to be outside and doing something and seeing some new terrain or the same terrain. But, again, back in the day, there wasn't this clear path or groups or whatever. And so I didn't know what to do. So I would, grab a canoe with my buddy, and we'd canoe down our little river, and then we'd portage through, like Main Street, and then we'd keep going, and we'd stop and make a fire and cook a chicken on a spit. And as I got a little older, we would, do some crazy bike things. And this was before pack rafts. We'd get some like kids inner tubes and we'd swim across lakes with our bikes on top. And it was me just really trying to discover those places in unique ways. And what I felt was, well, first of all, I've always felt that, any sort of human travel is just a great way to experience an area, unlike, driving in a car, flying a plane or whatever. Those are different. You get an idea of the scale and scope of a place, but it's when your feet are on the ground in some way, or you're working for every, foot forward, it becomes a much different experience. And I also felt that a lot of people in the adventure community were kind of focused on these big iconic things, even through hikes, and not everybody has access to these bigger through hike areas. Not everybody has the ability to take off this amount of time to go do some sort of bigger adventure. And so I just kind of came up with this idea, and it's nothing new. I mean, other people are doing similar things, but it was more about this idea of that adventure is everywhere. And that if you kind of put some arbitrary parameters on something, I said one border of the state to the next, it could be your county, it could be your city, it could be whatever. And then 3 sports, I was just like, okay, let's just do 3 sports. And then it becomes really compelling and interesting to me. Because one, I get to do some fun planning. I get to figure out like, how can I connect these 2 points in a compelling line that makes sense, that's somewhat natural. What are the logistics involved with that? And then also I like to take whatever I think is a realistic amount of time and then chop down that a little bit so it becomes more difficult as well. And I got to say, like, I haven't done a ton of them, but I've done Colorado, New York, Wisconsin, Kansas, and they've all had their kind of epic challenges.
So four Stateathons you've done.
Yeah. And they're nice because I kind of squeeze them into my schedule now, in between when I'm kind of doing something else, great train. I'm hiking, I'm trying to get 25 miles, and doing that in the Adirondacks is like impossible for somebody like me, and so it's like, 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. or 10 p.m., nonstop. And then of course I'm getting lost because I don't, it's just when you're stringing stuff together, navigation can be not crazy challenging, but it's, there's enough variability out there. And so they end up being quite physically challenging, and then the logistics side. And then we usually try to partner with some sort of area nonprofit. I kind of have a philosophy of have fun and do good. And so I feel that adventure has given me a lot of really great opportunities, a lot of really incredible kind of life lessons and philosophies. And so try to work with some of my current sponsors and do some sort of GoFundMe page or whatever it is for a nonprofit in that area. And so we'll raise, $4,000 or $5,000 for different organizations that are regionally based in that state.
Right. Now, I said at the top of the show that you had done South Pole, North Pole, top of Mount Everest, and I think you're the only person to have done that. Is that accurate?
In a year, yeah.
In a year, that's right. In a year. And I would also now venture to say that you're the first person to do 4 Stateathons. I'm not sure that anybody else is out there doing that.
Yeah, and quite honestly, that's part of my mindset, I guess, or emphasis or goal, or however you want to word it. I think for me, I want to be original in what I do. Some things are somewhat arbitrary, like, but when I see 10 people going this way, I kind of want to go this way. And so part of the joy for me of adventure is kind of blazing, quote unquote, blazing my own trail, so to speak. And, once I'm able to, in the Stateathon things, connect some of these things, it becomes much more interesting to me than just hiking a trail that, has some pretty clear markers or whatever. And I love it. I mean, don't get me wrong. I love being outside and I love beautiful scenery and all this kind of stuff, but I like that little bit of extra. And so my philosophy has always been to try to push that leading edge of adventure, and not in some stupid kind of gimmicky way, but just ways that I feel like are compelling, that are challenging, that have a unique narrative to them, that are fun, and that's kind of how I'm always thinking about things.
Right. It's interesting. You use those words, trailblazer or blazing a trail. I actually was taking some notes as you were talking, and I have now in a box, before you said it, I said trailblazer, because you're out there doing stuff that is unique, not only from your epic year where you did the 2 poles in Mount Everest, but also, kind of teaching yourself these outdoor explorer skills and these Stateathons. It's outside the box. It's unique, and it's you're blazing your own trail out there. That's
Yeah,
awesome.
and the other thing with the Stateathons, it's kind of, like I said earlier, it's this idea of adventure is everywhere, and a lot of my expeditions really are about these bigger ideas than just myself. And it's just a reminder for everybody. Like, again, if you pick up Backpacker magazine, you're not going to find a lot of stories about Iowa in there, and that doesn't mean there aren't any compelling adventures to be had there, or great hikes, or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, in this day and age, and social media, and inundated with these kind of like hyper real things, we all, myself included, need these reminders like, hey, we can do some pretty interesting things on our own. We can set up this thing, be original within this small little box. We can be challenged in my backyard. I started another side little gig called Backyard Epics. And again, this wasn't necessarily about being just original on my own, but it's about sharing that idea. It's like, hey, you can create your own, multi-sport adventure. And, kind of, we'll see if I ever get this done, but I have the URL. But, you can log your own, 3-sport adventure. Maybe somebody else copies it, or maybe you race it, or whatever. But again, just as this reminder to people, like, you don't always have to be looking off far and somewhere else. There are a lot of things that you can do. And I think that starts opening up nature and adventure in a much more accessible way. It's not this elitist thing. It's
Right.
something that anybody can do. And another one of my kind of philosophies is the idea of just starting small. Like, if you've never backpacked before, it's probably not a good idea to go hike the AT trail your first time out, or even a week-long trip. Do an overnight.
I've had a couple of guests that have gone full blast into hiking and done a serious big trip like that as their first trip.
Yeah, I mean, it's not impossible. There's no question. That said, are you gonna have a better first couple of weeks if you've done some other trips? Most definitely.
Right. Right. So backyard epics, that's not literally in your backyard. That's kind of in your hometown.
It could be anywhere. I mean,
your area, you can set up
yeah.
your own multi-sport.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there's all sorts of opportunities. I mean, it could be in a city, it could be in your county, could be in your backyard. It just, the point is that there are a lot of opportunities to have some adventures. We did a trip here in Crested Butte, where I live now in Colorado, kind of on a similar vein. It wasn't across the state. It was just 3 days, and we biked 35 miles, we hiked 12 miles, and then we paddle boarded a couple miles, and we connected this kind of wilderness area to some other places that were just really amazing. And it's just, again, you just set those arbitrary parameters, and now all of a sudden it's a challenge. Like, how do we get our bikes? How do we get our backpacks? What bikes are we going to do? We need to paddle on water. It's flat water. What are the conditions going to be like? Where is our put in? Where's our takeout?
You mentioned some stuff that I don't want to skip over. I want to go back to it a little bit, but you have me thinking now about, these multi-sport adventures, and wanted to know if you have ever heard of the picnic.
Oh, of there are other people. I mean, Alex Honnold and Cedar Wright were out in the Cascades biking and climbing, and, people, it's not any sort of like new idea.
Right.
And the picnic, is awesome. I mean, I had heard about that. And of course, as soon as I saw that, whenever the first time was, I was like, oh yeah, that's awesome. So, I mean, there's definitely like, kind of a groundswell of this type of adventure that goes on, especially as, more of these iconic things kind of get checked off. And so I think a lot of that is really positive because it creates these opportunities to do all these other things in areas that you wouldn't think of. Like, for example, I was in Kansas this summer doing a trip, and it was incredible. And we biked in like 95-degree heat and 100% humidity just about, and then hiked through a pretty incredible area, and then paddled down the Kansas River. So yeah, I mean, I'm just kind of piggybacking on that, but I do think, taking that thing and attaching a bigger idea than just yourself has some importance. Hopefully. I mean, who knows?
For our listeners out there who may be tuning in for the first time, the Picnic is a multi-sport adventure out in, you start at Jackson Hole, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you ride your bike for, 20 something miles out to Jenny Lake. You swim 2 miles across Jenny Lake, and then you climb the Grand Teton.
Yeah.
And then you turn around and you do it in reverse.
Come back. Yeah.
That's right. You come back. And I learned about that on an episode with Mike Chambers from
I know Mike.
Beat Monday. And that was one of the episodes that they did for that show. And it really kicked his butt.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the thing. And that's what I like. And that's part of one of the reasons why I like big expeditions, because it's different than just like going to the gym and lifting weights. I mean, Mike and what's his partner's name, who's also good. I mean, he's just ripped. He's like 3 of me.
Yes, he is ripped.
Jason Anton.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And I know both of those guys pretty well, and kind of consulted them on some Greenland stuff that they did. Nice. But and Jason's fit as all get out, so he doesn't need any of my advice. But for the average person like myself, there's a difference of being out and that wear and tear, that repetitive use that your body gets over those longer things. It's not necessarily like the most difficult thing in that second, but it's like, this hour and the next hour and continuously being on your feet. And that's what I like, because that's a little bit more of a chess game. And then you have to not only tie in your training, but your planning and your self-care and your nutrition and navigate the weather and all these moves have back farther on down the road. And that's what part of my joy is in the bigger expeditions as well, because it's there's a cumulative effect that I think people oftentimes overlook.
Right. Now, when you were talking about growing up and even I think your young adulthood, you mentioned a lot of states. You mentioned Wisconsin, you mentioned Alaska, Colorado, Minnesota, back to Colorado.
Yeah.
Did you live sort of a nomadic lifestyle growing up? Did your family move a lot? Or
no. This was after college.
After college. Okay.
I moved around a lot. Yeah, I did a lot of seasonal work. So I went to college and probably shouldn't have gone to college. I was a crazy dude. But I managed to hone it in because I thought, man, if I don't do it now, I'm never going to finish. But as soon as I got done, I was just gone. I was gone. And so I was just trying to eat up as much stuff as I could. And I also, again, my world went from like this to just everything. And once I realized that if you could sacrifice stability, money, insurance or whatever, if you were willing to sacrifice all those things, you could do whatever you want. And so, I just went great, just all out. And, I didn't have any money. I had student loans. And so there's some good tracks that you can get in, like with Outward Bound or Knowles or whatever, but I had never had the financial ability to do those. And so it was always for me working different jobs and trying to find, the next interesting thing that I could do and learn. And, so yeah, I was a backcountry ranger in Alaska, I was a whitewater guide in Colorado. I was a bike mechanic on a bike tour across the United States, carpenter, chimney sweep. I became a dog musher as well. I'd never even seen a sled dog before. And then as a dog musher, then I was like, oh yeah, I get it now. This is awesome.
That's quite the resume.
I've had way too many jobs. Yeah. Yeah.
And so I'm assuming that you you didn't do carpentry work or be a dog musher to pay for your more recent expeditions to the South Pole, North Pole, and Everest. You mentioned sponsors. How did that all evolve from just trying, living kind of hand to mouth and saving up, cobbling up enough money to pay for, the next adventure, to being able to put something like the North Pole, South Pole, Everest trip
Yeah,
together?
it was a slow process, and of course back in the day, we didn't even think about sponsorship. It just wasn't an option. There was no. I remember I got like a 40% deal on some mittens one time, and I thought I was just like I had reached the top.
Big time right there.
And but it again, this was like in the mid 90s and early 2000s, just wasn't the same. So and part of that is really good because I did trips because I was interested in them. I took jobs because I was interested in them. Did a lot of things on my own, made a lot of huge mistakes, and nobody saw it, and I learned from it and moved on. But I had started working with bigger expeditions and started to get glimpses into what the sponsorship world was. And in the early 2001, I was the base camp manager for a 4-month-long dog sled expedition. So I started to get a glimpse of how that whole world worked. And they had National Geographic on board, and, it was definitely like this higher echelon type of a thing. And I was just in there eating everything up that I could, just taking mental notes and seeing everything. And then through that, I got introduced to another kind of polar guy who lived in my small town in northern Minnesota. And we started kind of hanging out more, and then started, working on this big North Pole project in 2003, I believe, or 2 or something like that. And that's kind of when, he had already been down that path doing a couple big expeditions. And so he was very much a mentor for me in that. And I also just kind of thought about different ideas and tried to bring those to the table. And, but it was a necessity because, like a polar expedition, like the budget at our first trip was $350,000, that's just not, that's not something I have laying around in a coffee can in my.
That's a lot of dog mushing right there.
Yeah. It's a lot of everything. And
your mentor is anybody we may have heard of?
Lonnie Dupree.
Another
Minnesota guy. Mentor in some ways and not mentor in other ways, I will say. But I, again, I'm an optimist and I choose to look at the good things. I learned a lot about what not to do as well, but
that's
another
important.
Story for another time.
Yeah.
But yeah, and so, we were able to pull that trip off, but we spent 3 years planning and preparing that for that one single trip. And kind of once I went through that process in my prior experience, I just had enough insight into what was going on. And simultaneously, the world was, social media was starting up, and I started kind of doing a lot of outreach. And so it's always a process. I mean, even today, it's not like people are just calling me up and handing me checks, it's about creating value, and it's a huge hustle, as well, in the good way. But it's about connections and all sorts of other stuff. So, I mean, I would say that, that first stuff that we did, which was in 2001, and now it's almost 20 years later, I've learned a lot, and it's still just as much hard work, It's just different kinds of hard work. It's there's some aspects that are easier. I can send an email to a company and get a reply guaranteed, but it's always a challenge.
Right.
And I think the other thing is I think, the sponsorship side of things, I get a lot of emails from people about like, well, how do I get sponsored? And I give people a lot of advice that they don't like, which is to get really good at something, take about 5 or 10 years and become an expert, and then plan something original and then get sponsored. But nobody wants to hear that. And I also think there is some margins in there for the influencer stuff and brand ambassador things that are a little different. But I do feel that the sponsorship is not a right, it's a privilege.
Yeah.
And so it's something that I take pretty seriously, not pretty serious, very seriously. And it's a full-time job. You know, it's not like, again, people are just handing me stuff and be like, all right, see you in another year. We'll give you some more stuff. You know, that's not how it works.
Right. That's what I told Mrs. Doc, my wife. I said, hey, you know, I got to devote 10 years to this podcasting thing before, you know, the sponsorships are going to start rolling.
Yeah.
Yeah. You gotta put in your time.
I tell my wife that same thing, and I'm like, it's A to M, which is like, if you do this thing right here, it's not you do it and then B happens and everything's great. It's B influences C, and C kind of dings off a D, and D circles around for a while, and then all of a sudden it somehow gets to E, you know, and then 3 years later, finally you're at M, and there's the something. So
I like that. That's awesome. A to M, and we're just happy that it's not A to Z, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And sometimes it is, but you know, it's definitely not A to B. So
yeah. Hey, do you want to give a shout out to any of your sponsors?
I mean, I work with a lot of great companies. You know, I've been with MSR and Thermarest for quite some time now. Worked with Thermarest to design a really awesome sleeping bag called the Polar Ranger. You can find it online, -20 bag that I use on all my expeditions. MSR makes some of the best products. And then I've been working with a great company the last couple years called Cirrus Innovation, hats, gloves, glove liners, base layers. I do not like being cold. I like being really warm in cold places. So Cirrus has been a really great partner for me.
That just caught me a little bit funny because, you know, spending so much time at the South Pole, North Pole, and top of Everest, and not liking being cold. That's kind of a dichotomy there.
It is, but you know, that's how I was built. What can I say? I like what I do. I am drawn to kind of these extreme environments. You know, for me, it's cold, but like when I go to the desert or wherever, I'm equally as intrigued. But I like this idea of extreme and trying to like eke out some sort of existence in that. Mm-hmm. But like, yeah, like I said, being cold is not a fun experience. I mean, I get it. It's painful. But what I do like to do is be comfortable in those environments. And there's times every hour where I'm one type of cold or the other, but you know, I try to minimize the peaks and the troughs. But those times when I'm just perfect and I'm traveling wrong and it's just a shitstorm out there, man, that's a good moment that you remember. Nice.
Ever cross paths with Mike Horn?
I haven't. I don't know if we've emailed or not, but I'm a huge fan. There's a few polar people out there, and I think, you know, Mike and his partner that he's done a couple trips with, Berga Ausland, they did their most recent trip across the Arctic Ocean, both really you know, pushing the edge of stuff. And I draw a lot of inspiration from other people, those guys especially.
Yeah, I've had a couple of guests that have crossed paths, spent a little bit of time with him, and just talked about how inspirational he is, and just the things that he's doing out there are just nuts.
Yeah, and I think that for me, that's, you know, I didn't necessarily model my career after him. He's a little older than me, but mm-hmm. I think we're the similar mindset, which is, you know, trying to still blaze that trail, trying to push that leading edge in whatever way. And it's, you know, the world has been explored, but there are still some opportunities in there to kind of keep pushing those human limits in that place. And so to me, that's always exciting.
Yep. All right. Hey, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to get down into the nitty gritty of the epic year of the South Pole, North Pole, and top of Everest. And I also want to touch base with Eric about his book, On Thin Ice. So stay tuned for that. We'll be right back.
Hi, my name is Eric Larsen. I'm a polar adventurer and expedition guide, and I want to welcome you to the John Freaking Muir Pod.
And welcome back. Hey, Eric, I forgot to ask you at the top of the show, do you have a trail name? Did you ever pick up a trail name on any backpacking trips?
No. I'm not totally into that. It's funny though. I do like the concept, and I've done some kind of media events, and I'll always like give people random trail names just for fun. Like Snowwalker, I don't know what, you know. And I'm pretty good at it, actually, I will say, like just talking to people, like what's really interesting to you, and just like in a couple minutes, like giving them a name. But no, I've never, I'm a not a solo guy, but a small group guy. Like it would, I've thought about the AT trail and things like that. I would have a real hard time mingling in those areas long enough. I just am real, I like being on my own.
Yeah.
No trail name.
Okay. Well, if you're a solo guy, AT is not for you. It should be the PCT. It's a lot more remote, not close to civilization. You get out there, you're on your own, away from everybody.
Yeah.
All right, because we go strictly by trail name on the show, so I was looking forward to. I wondered if Polar Explorers also had that same kind of tradition of trail names.
Polar Explorers are solitary introverts by their nature, so it's like not happening.
Okay, all right. So hey, let's talk about 10 years ago, 2010. How did the idea come up? And how did you organize all the logistics and fund the South? Was it in that order, South Pole, North Pole, top of Everest, or was it a different order?
No, that was the order.
That was the order. Okay. So.
Yeah, and the order was really, about the seasonality of when you can travel to each one of those places. The only time you go to Antarctica is in Antarctic summer, which is November, December, and a little bit of January. I had done a summer North Pole expedition previously. That was hard as F. And it was also expensive, but the traditional season is March and April, which ties into May, which ties into the Everest season. So I kind of realized that I would have to do Everest in the fall if I was going to try to meet all that stuff up. Mm-hmm. And I actually originally thought, the other way to do it would be to lead off with Everest potentially, but quite honestly, when I was starting out and ready to go, I didn't have any money. So and basically I got the idea in maybe 2007. I had gotten some email from somebody who wanted to do a North Pole trip and then maybe go to the South Pole, back to back. And I was like, oh wow, that's a cool idea. I would love to go to Antarctica. I don't really think in the US polar travel is not really that like it's not like alpine skiing or football or basically any other thing has like people that are coming up and there's an industry associated with it. Polar travelers like me and then nobody. Right. So it's not a really good business venture for companies, and so I didn't think I would get any funding to go to Antarctica. And I also, people had done some back-to-back polar trips like that, so it was kind of terra cognita as far as I was concerned. But then as I started kind of digging around, a lot of people considered Everest the third pole, like in the 20s and the 30s. And it was like the third pole, getting to the third pole, the highest point on the planet. And as I did more research, I realized that, only a handful of people, like at the time, 10 or 14 people had been to all three of those places in big expeditions. And no one had ever done them in a shorter continuous time frame. And I thought, wow, well, that makes a really unique trip. And it's also, on a personal level, that was a really interesting challenge for me because I hadn't really done any Mount Aaron at all. And so I knew that I would need to really focus on that, but then also this bigger kind of logistical challenge of getting to all these three places. It just really met a lot of my kind of needs, and then interests, and then kind of on this bigger idea of communicating about the environment, which is a really important aspect of me and what I studied and what I do. And so I felt like that was a really compelling kind of narrative of going to these last great frozen wildernesses and documenting how they're changing. And so that's kind of how it all came about. And and I was actually planning another trip at the time, but then this idea kept nagging at me. And what I've learned is there's just this process that I go through until one idea just sticks, and then it's like, boom. And then that's the best time, because then you just start working on that one thing, and then everything else fades away. But this was, 2007, 2008, had the height of the financial housing crisis.
That's right.
And so funding was just, I was bartending, I was cleaning chimneys. And this is already after having been on the Tonight Show 2 times from our prior expeditions, and, all this other stuff and success. But I was living in my buddy's basement, sleeping on a beach at times, like I said, bartending, barely making ends meet, and just trying to, get another no, another no, another no. And I was just, man, I was ready to just throw in the towel. And I got lucky in the sense that I got, but all the time still kind of working on this communication plan and reaching out to media people and just building these relationships over, year, doing presentations anywhere, anytime I could do a presentation, I would travel all over. And then I got really lucky. I got a job offer to guide a South Pole expedition, and have never been to Antarctica, but so I took that, and that kind of just opened up a little bit just inside of me, because I was able to go down, do that trip, learn more about Antarctica on a shorter route, 42 days route to the South Pole, and just have all my costs. Actually, it was a job, and just kind of jump started me too. And then at that time, then I was able to be like, all right, well, the deadline's coming up. I'm starting this thing next year. What's it going to be? Yes or no? No. Okay, perfect. How about you? Yes or no? Yes. Okay. $2. Great. Thank you. Boop. And next person, no. Okay, thank you. Not like, okay, yeah, no problem. Take your time. So, and that just kind of momentum just kind of started snowballing. That being said, I still didn't have much money the next year, but I was able to do another South Pole guiding on that route that I had originally planned.
Eric, how do you get a job as a South? How do you get a job as a South Pole or an Antarctic guide, not having done it before? Did they just give you, hey, here's the map. Here's the map. Here's the 10 people you're guiding. Hit the trail, get going. How does that work?
Well, honestly, I've done a lot of guiding like that in places that I don't know. Prior, as a dog mushing guide, my boss was crazy, and he would just draw this pencil line across wherever, and he'd be like, turn right at the car, and it would be like 10 feet of snow on the ground there. I didn't see any car. So, but Antarctica, realistically, like polar travel is the same no matter where you go, but quite honestly, like Antarctica is a lot easier travel than the Arctic Ocean, the North Pole. So having already done a prior North Pole expedition, that was one of the hardest the summer expedition North Pole, which again was probably at the time one of the hardest expeditions anybody had ever done, and a big unknown, and was just crazy and insane. And man, I was crying like almost every day. Having gotten through that 62 days on the ice, like the South Pole is a piece of cake. And so, I had cut my teeth and had a lot of other prior guiding experience. So I didn't just show up like, out of the blue. And in Antarctica, like the map, like I draw a map for the clients when I go now, and I'm just like, I take a white sheet of paper and I put an X on the bottom and I put an X on the top. And I'm like, this is our map that we're following. And that's what it is. You just, I put in my GPS 90 degrees south, and that's what we do every day. We just start skiing that every day. So, so I was able to then go back the next year, which would be kind of my first leg of the Save the Poles trip, which was kind of how I designed it anyways. It was my little like fail safe. So I did my route that I wanted to do, which was a 50 or 48 day route called the Hercules Inlet route. So it's from the edge of the continent to the South Pole, and it's kind of this traditional like route to the South Pole. And so that's how I was able to do that. Then I got back, again, no money, but I had all these relationships. And so I was just calling everybody again, and luckily got connected to Microsoft and had a meet and talked to a woman there. And I was like, oh, I'll be out in Seattle next week. And she's, okay, we'll stop by, because that's my thing. And of course I had no plans to be out there. So I went and got a plane ticket real quick, flew out, and then we got some money together from them last minute. And we still needed a rescue deposit. So we mortgaged my expedition partner's house and his kid's college fund, to be able to pay for the rescue deposit, which was $100,000, and got another guy to come in with some other funding from university, and we just cobbled it all together. I mean, it was crazy. And then we spent all that on the North Pole and managed to pull that trip off. And then I got back and I was broke, and I started the whole process over, flew over to Everest Base Camp and or flew over to Nepal at the end of August, hiked up to Everest Base Camp, was in Everest Base Camp calling my sponsors, being like, okay, is that check coming? Because, so it was just, and then I was, 50 or 80 grand in debt when it was all done. I mean, I rolled the dice on that baby, but I was in it, I was in it, I was committed, and I was, it didn't necessarily influence my decision making, but it influenced my drive, and I kind of laid it all bare on that one.
Yeah. How many days on the South Pole trip? Sorry, South Pole.
That
trip?
was a 48-day expedition, around
48
730 miles. North Pole was 51 days, 550 miles, and then we were about 45 days on Everest.
And I wanted to ask you, when the polar expeditions, especially, any sense of history when you're out there, knowing the struggles that polar explorers from a century ago had, and the lives that were lost, and here you are doing that same thing. Any just
yeah, I mean,
it's kind of
as a
awe-inspiring.
kid, yeah, well, it's as well as pathetic, because you're like 100 years going by, I'm still doing the same thing. Yeah, no, I read a ton of expedition journals and adventure books. I mean, that was my diet for so long. And so, when I read those, I was always inspired and kind of with the mindset of like, oh, what went wrong here? Like, what was this little thing about? What was this piece of gear? What was this like team dynamics thing? Same thing with mountaineering too, just kind of trying to learn from those people that have come before me. So the history, we're standing on the shoulders of giants for sure. In these types of expeditions. So it's not lost on me at all. We just passed the anniversary of when Amundsen got to the South Pole a few days ago, 14th of December. So those things are very stark for me in terms of we're like, I understand their passion. I understand their drive. I understand what they went through. I've learned a lot from them as a result. And, quite honestly, that type of struggle is the exception in society. And so there's some, I feel a little like camaraderie with those people too. We've experienced a lot of the same things.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, of the three, which was the toughest?
That's the $1 million question. Yeah. North Pole is the hardest expedition on the planet, hands down. The Arctic Ocean is one of the most extreme environments on the planet. It's just harsh, and it's extreme cold. It's humid. The ice is moving. It's oftentimes pushing you backwards. Polar bears, it's just, the list goes on and on and on. It's every step is in the unknown. Even on Everest, I climbed through the South Col, and so that's like a known route, but the Arctic Ocean is constantly changing. The surface is constantly shifting. It's always uncertain. And so there's just this kind of level of uncertainty that you just never can get comfortable with. And then just the physical being in that environment is really difficult. It's just hard on your body. And even just being in a tent is difficult. And cold and uncomfortable. And so there's just no relief. It's not like, I always love camping in the summer, and where I just love laying in the dirt, in front of my tent and like eating freeze-dried food, like on my elbow. Like, we're either moving or we're in the tent. Like, there's no in between on those trips. And, it's death by 1,000 cuts. Every little piece of energy, you lose energy every day that never returns. And it's that kind of chess game that I was talking about earlier. And so, and it's just difficult. It's just continuously difficult and unrelenting.
Yeah. Now I have yet to be able to talk to somebody who has stood atop Everest. And so I'm really excited that you're here tonight to kind of share that experience. Now, you said, was it 45 days
yeah, I mean, from base camp
portion of the trip?
or maybe I can't remember, flying up from hiking up from Lukla. So, I mean, I think we were in base camp about 30, maybe a little over 30 days at base camp till the summit and then back down again. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. No, so I read Into Thin Air by Krakauer, and sounded miserable. And so 30 days in base camp, was that to acclimatize? And
well, not 30 days total, but so I think our whole trip was, I got to go back into the archives here, but I think it was like 45 days from, being in the Khumbu Valley. So, we fly into a place called Lukla, which is around 9,000 feet. Take a bunch of days, 10 days or so to hike up to Everest Base Camp, which is around 17.5, 17.6. Once you get to base camp, then your job is to move gear up the mountain and acclimatize. And because we were climbing in the fall, there's just no other people on the mountain. The main climbing season is in the spring. So there was a Czech team there was attempting Lhotse. There was a Japanese team. Those guys dropped out pretty quickly. And then that just left myself and a few Sherpas. So we're bringing stuff up, coming back down and resting for a couple of days, bringing stuff up higher, coming back down, resting, getting the ropes fixed up higher. And so, I wasn't involved with a lot of the rope fixing, and there wasn't a lot done overall, but it was hard, but not the hardest thing I've ever done. So I think, again, like I had done years of bigger expeditions. And so there's an expedition mentality that goes into, any of these big trips, that once you kind of understand your body and your nutritional needs and how sleep plays into a role, the most difficult part was kind of like going into these unknowns and then coming back into known and comfort. And so like in the North Pole, I was talking about everything is unknown. And so like that you're on a high level alert all the time, but you kind of like get to hear. Mm-hmm. And on Everest for me, because I had never climbed Everest before or been up above, 7,000 meters or whatever, it was kind of like, we come up to a new area, like just to the top of the Khumbu Glacier, and that would be scary for me. But then we come back, down and then rest. Next time up, no big deal, so I'm like down here, but then we keep going up the Western Khum, and then all of a sudden that's a new thing. And then coming back down and I'm relaxed again, and then relax, and then going up to Camp 3, up the Lhotse face, And so it was kind of this back and forth for me a little bit. That was somewhat unnerving. That was probably the biggest challenge. The physical aspect was difficult, but it was really cool to be able to be there in a season where there wasn't anybody else there. And so for me and my style, I really enjoyed that, and kind of, again, trying to be unique. And Everest has yet to be summited in the fall since. So it's been 10 years, and there was a group that tried this year, and there was a big serac kind of like ominously looming over base camp, and they bailed. So hopefully somebody will knock it off again, but really cool opportunity.
Wow.
To be there then.
Would you mind taking us through that day that you summited and what you experienced on top of Everest, the tallest point on the planet?
Well, so we had kind of spent that month or whatever, how many days, getting gear up, fixing ropes or whatever. And through that process in the fall, it snows, it's colder. And so like anytime it snows, the fixed lines get buried. And it takes a lot of effort at altitude to pull those fixed lines, especially if they've been drifted in out. And so we're kind of at the point now, we're like, all right, well, let's just have a good weather window. But then there's also this, like, if it snows again, we're fucked, because there's just a ton more work. And so I had a buddy of mine who I worked with in Antarctica, who's actually a Belgian, who's a weather forecaster. And he can sit at his computer in Belgium and forecast Everest. And he's like, all right, October 15th to 16th, you got a good weather window, or October, I don't know, or 13th to 15th maybe. But on 15th, it's snowing at all levels. And so we were like, all right, let's do it. So the 13th, we leave, we go up to camp, we go hike all the way up to Camp 2, spend a night there. Next night, get up to Camp 3, which is around 24,000 feet on the Lhotse face. It's just a small little area carved out there. There's not much there. Next morning we wake up, go up the rest of the Lhotse face, up across the Yellow Band, over the Geneva Spur, and then get up to the South Col in the late afternoon. South Col is kind of like a big football flat area, and it's such a relief after being on the Lhotse face, you know, because it's just, the Lhotse face just goes up forever, and it's just not terribly steep, but steep enough for somebody like me from the Midwest that it's like, okay, I don't really feel great up here. And so then we kind of hunkered down, had some soup, and then began our summit like at midnight. And a couple of Sherpas had gone up with some rope ahead of us, and then me and another one of the Sherpas left at around midnight, and then we caught them right at about sunrise. Or it was the Yellow Band. We caught them at the Geneva Spur, maybe. Anyway, and then we waited. We got up, kept climbing, and finally got to the South Summit. And the weather was just shit. I mean, we could see this kind of like, well, first of all, it was incredible to be out there. And, you know, when we started climbing, it was dead quiet. It was calm. Stars were just like right there all around, you know, it's like you could reach up and touch them. And then you watch this sunrise and you're like looking down at the sunrise, you know, it's just incredible. And this beautiful mountains everywhere, just like other tall mountains. And then this line of clouds kind of rolling in, that bad weather. And we got to the South Summit, and it was just a total whiteout. And I don't know if you remember, if you saw the movie Into Thin Air, but or in the book, it's where in the movie they do a pretty good job of like Rob Hall's like kind of like talking to his wife on the phone, and he's kind of like, that's where that is at the South Summit. And between the South Summit and the Hillary Step, it kind of comes down a little bit, and there's a long ridge, and it's, you know, it's a stark drop off. And it was just like a whiteout. You can't see anything. So like, I don't know if you've ever been a whiteout, you know, a lot of ski areas or whatever, we have them all the time at polar travel. You can't see anything. It's like being inside of a ping pong ball. And so it doesn't take much to just be like, you're done. And we also ran out of fixed line because we were bringing it all up. Normally in the spring, you've got a bunch of Sherpa groups that are bringing up rope over the course of a couple of days, fixing ropes, coming back down, and they all kind of share that task. We just had our rope with us, and so we ran out of fixed line. And we still got to get across this ridge line. And so I was like, we're fucked, man. I'm like, we should turn around. I've been in enough situations, like it's starting to get, it wasn't crazy late, but it was like 11. And I was like, I've been in enough situations to know like this is not how things end really well. And this one guy was cheering, was like, you sure? I'm like, I'm pretty. And I was like, I didn't want to answer him because he's like, you sure? Because he would, you know, we all knew what the cars were. And I like didn't answer. I'm like, well, let's just wait. And so we found some old rope underneath the South Summit, tied it up a little bit, granny knot, got over. One of the guys led up the Hillary Step. It cleared. So we were just laying in the snow there for a while. And then there was a blue donut that just opened up right above us. And then one of the guys went up, led up the Hillary Step, and I just jammed my hand straight in there, like in the snow, and just didn't look around, you know, you just focus right in. I mean, I'm not a adrenaline junkie. I don't have that gene. So I got to really, it's like, I'm tightening the screws as hard as I can to just, you know, not think about this other stuff. But once you get up over the Hillary Step, it's just a nice little walk up to the summit. And so we did that. We got up there, and it was just, to me, it was a relief. Not about necessarily like being on the top of the world or whatever, but that we had just done it, and now we could focus on getting down. And so we weren't up there for very long. And as we turned around, we got across, got back down the Hillary Step, got up to the South Summit, and then just weighed out, you know. And so we had also taken a bunch of our rope sections up. So we were kind of like had these empty sections of fixed line. And so we were kind of having to do some other stuff, you rope travel on the way down. That was like not fun in these conditions, and finally got back down to the South Col, and it was like I couldn't see anything. I was like on my hands and knees looking for footprints back to our tent or whatever, and then rested up for that night, and then came down the next day and just like snow. I mean, just like we waded through the whole Western Coombe with just like knee deep snow, man. So we like just squeaked it out. It was pretty wild, and then still had to go down the Coombe Ice Fall, and it wasn't until I got my tent that night at base camp that I was like, okay, I just relaxed a little bit.
I'm such a relief.
Yeah. It was a nail biter.
Wow, that is incredible, especially, being up there and the blue sky coming out just for that moment that allowed you to make that rush to the top. That's incredible.
Yeah. I would have turned. I mean, I was so close to turning around, and we got lucky, and that was the bottom line on that one.
Well, thank you for sharing that. That is epic. Truly, truly epic.
Yeah.
Maybe one of the best stories we've had on the pod here. So thank you. Hey, you mentioned the North Pole several times, and you talked about 62 days out on the ice. Was that the basis for your book, On Thin Ice? Was that specific trip, or was that a different trip?
No, that was actually my first North Pole expedition, was 62 days. That was the first ever summer expedition to North Pole. I've been kind of on this mission for a long time, about doing these big expeditions to communicate about these places, to really use that human journey to be a springboard to talk about these bigger issues. And for me, the Arctic Ocean, the North Pole, has always been this iconic place. It's the place I'm fascinated with. It's environmentally challenged, and it's something that just keeps drawing me back. And so, we did 2006 trip there, 2010 as part of the 3 poles. And then I wanted to go back and kind of do a big film project, as well as just travel in this unsupported style, a much more difficult style of expedition. Mm-hmm. And that was in 2014. So that's what, that trip is what On Thin Ice is based off of.
Okay. And any epic moments from that particular trip? It sounds like there's epic moments every day.
Every day was
on the way up to the North Pole. So,
I mean,
we stand out.
Yeah. I mean, we averaged like under 3 miles a day for the first 3 weeks of the trip. By day 40, we still had 180 miles to go. Having to swim across open water leads, getting stalked and followed by polar bears, almost running out of fuel. I mean, the trip was just one incredible hardship after the next, and as a result, a very incredible journey when it was all said and done as well, and compelling narrative.
And where can we find the book on Thin Ice?
Yeah, you can on Amazon or wherever you buy books. Just Google on Thin Ice.
Okay, very good. Back to the 3 poles expedition, real quick. I know there's so many moments in each of those sections of that year. Can you boil it down to a top 5?
I mean, I think the first would just be being in those places. Each one of those places is really unique. They have these amazing personalities. I think being a small person in a huge space is always something that's been compelling to me. Mm-hmm. And so I just love that. And it's also totally overwhelming in the same breath, but imagine your life where you don't see anybody else for not just a day or a week, but 2 months. And that's not like, oh, you're just not talking to somebody that you like that's walking by in the trail. That's not seeing another soul. And so that's a really incredible experience. I think any time I get that, it's never lost on me. I think the culture of Nepal was a really incredible thing for me. When I traveled to the North and South Pole in the Arctic Ocean, there's nobody else there. And so being able to learn about a different culture and be in a place, interact with a lot of really incredible people was a really powerful experience for me. Learn about Sherpa, their religion, just their demeanors, was really incredible. I think the three, just pulling those trips together off is, to me, still amazing, that I, made it all happen and got lucky enough to be able to be successful at each one of those. Cause like, there's a million things that could go wrong just in each one of those legs, but to be able to put all three of those together in this successful way is, to me, dumbfounding to this day. I also think for probably the people that I traveled with, we had there were some arguments in there big time. But a lot of those people today I still correspond with and are good friends. Some of them aren't, and that's fine. And then, I just think camping, I love camping. And so I got, that year I spent over 6 months in a tent, and that's a pretty cool thing. So not my record by any stretch, but still a good amount of time in the tent.
That's a pretty good year.
Yeah.
Outstanding. Hey, Eric, you know where we are right now?
I don't.
We are at that time in the episode where I turn to you and ask you for your pro tip insight of the week. What can you share with our listeners that's going to make their next adventure that much better?
Buy low and sell high. That's the best advice I could give anybody. No, I'm just kidding. I'm a huge fan of starting small. I think, anytime that you can just take that first step and manage those variables, you're going to have a lot more success farther down the road. So, that doesn't, whether it's a little backpack trip or a full-on polar expedition, doesn't matter. You just take that first small step, and lots to be learned in those little things.
Yeah. So I'm guessing you would not recommend that an expedition to the North Pole be anybody's first expedition.
No. I mean, it's just expedition North Pole, Antarctica might as well be Mars. Like you look at there's nothing that sustains human life there. So you have this whole aspect of the gear. So you need the right gear that's going to withstand those conditions. You need to understand how to use it, how to repair it if it breaks. That knowledge doesn't come out of nowhere. And so you need to be familiar with that. You also need to have an expedition mindset where you can endure a lot of that stuff. That doesn't come overnight either. I wish it did, because I could have, not done a lot of crying and had a lot of hardships as a result. But, each one of these kind of facets is a really important part of the expedition, and they take time. That doesn't mean you need the most experience in the world, but there's a lot to be learned about making mistakes. And it's pretty easy to make a mistake when the consequences are lower. You can come back. You're not going to lose a leg. You're not going to frostbite all your fingers off. And so if you want to be successful at hard things, oftentimes it's definitely better to try to start small. I mean, I do a lot of gear testing and training just right in my backyard. Like I set up the tent and just go right out here. I have bigger things that I do as well to train, but it's a lot of this stuff that really adds up and has some big impacts and hopefully influences my success a lot.
Right. And I wanted to ask you a question. I know that it is both hard physically and it's hard mentally. So that's a given. But the three poles, was that harder physically or mentally for you?
I mean, I was back in society in between those trips, so it wasn't like it was this continuous thing. I think the mental part of these big expeditions is always harder than the physical. And it's this challenge because they're related. Your physical body really influences your mind and vice versa. And so you can't really separate them at times. But, when you're dealing with these big objectives and these really far away, far reaching, almost impossible goals, like you got to white knuckle it a lot of the time. And it's not easy to reel it in because, you're barely holding it together and you're also on the edge in terms of like where you are physically, but also just mentally in that layer after layer of stress. So the mental part of bigger expeditions is always a challenge. It never, maybe it's got a little easier, but not much, man.
Yeah. Wow. So there you have it. That's it. Season 2, episode 6 is in the books. I hope our listeners enjoyed our time with Eric, and I want to thank him for joining us this week. Eric, how can our listeners keep up with you on social media, and where can they find updates on your latest adventures?
You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at ELExplore, Facebook, Polar Explorer Eric Larsen, or you can just find my website, ericlarsenexplorer.com. Have all sorts of updates going on all the time.
Fantastic. Remember to check out the pod on social media as well. We are on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Twitter. And if you have comments or clips you want to share, you can send it to me at johnfreakinmuir@gmail.com. Eric, you mentioned quite a few book titles and other types of media that you did in preparing for some of your polar explorations. We also always are looking for good recommendations for some adventure media. Do you have a particular book title or documentary or other source of adventure that our listeners could tune into to kind of stay connected to the outside world?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many good books out there. I've been a fan of polar exploration forever, and so there's some really incredible books out there from explorers of the past. And one of mine favorites is Farthest North, which is a guy Fridtjof Nansen he's from Norway, one of the first guys to try to reach the North Pole by freezing his ship in. It's a story that kind of rivals Shackleton's story. Shackleton, of course, is another great story and incredible, just epic story of tale of survival. So there's a few different books about Shackleton that I've read. There's another great one called Shackleton's Forgotten Men, which is about the other expedition that was supposed to be bringing supplies to meet him along the way, which also met with quite a bit of mishap, which is pretty incredible as well.
Wow, I didn't know about that. I've read Endurance, which was quite the story about Shackleton and the South Pole. And the biggest surprise on Endurance is that nobody died.
Yeah, it was incredible amount of leadership and perseverance too.
Yep. That's awesome. Thank you. Well, that's a wrap from the John Freakin' Muir studio. Any shout outs to any potential listeners out there, Eric?
I'm all good. Enjoy.
All right.
Think snow.
Thank you for tuning in. Always remember, the trail is the trail. It doesn't care if you want to go downhill. It doesn't care if it's almost dark and you're looking for a campsite. The trail is the trail. Embrace the suck.